They say you can count your real friends on one hand, but I only ever needed one finger to point to mine. Mark Halden. He was the kind of guy people either envied or gravitated toward, never hovering in the middle, always standing out with that easygoing smile, a laugh that could disarm a room, and a loyalty I thought was carved in stone. From Little League to late-night college study sessions, from scraping together rent in our 20s to standing shoulder to shoulder at my wedding altar, he was there, not just in the background, but always in focus, always present, always dependable, or so I thought. If there was ever a second brother born to my family without blood, it was Mark. And if there was ever a single man I would have trusted with my life, with my future, with my wife, God help me, it was him. Our lives were entwined like roots from the same tree, growing parallel, yet always touching. Our families vacationed together every summer like some sitcom dream. Our kids went to the same school. Our wives hosted joint dinner parties that had neighbors envious of how perfect we all looked. And for over a decade, I genuinely believed I was living in a rare kind of paradise, built not on luck, but on shared struggle, brotherhood, and love. When I asked Lisa to marry me, Mark was the first to know. He was the one who helped pick out the ring, who planned the bachelor party, who stood by my side as I said, I do. And while I looked into her eyes, feeling like the luckiest man alive, he stood 2 feet away, clapping the loudest, smiling like he meant it. I didn't know then, of course, that one day I'd look back at that moment and see it not as the beginning of something beautiful, but as the first scene in the worst kind of betrayal a man can suffer. Even now, if I close my eyes and think hard enough, I can still hear the sound of Mark's toast at our wedding reception, bold, funny, a little inappropriate like always, and full of love. Or at least something that sounded a hell of a lot like it. He called us the kind of couple Hallmark movies get jealous of, and everyone laughed. And I laughed too, completely blind to the fact that this man, this brother in arms, this so-called best friend, would one day be the one I'd catch sneaking out the back door of my marriage with the woman I'd spent 17 years building a life with. But back then, we were invincible. Or maybe I was just too naive to see that the cracks had already started forming, quiet as a whisper, buried beneath the weight of everything I thought was real. They say storms don't always come with thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like a shift in the wind or a door left slightly ajar, and you don't even realize you're in danger until the roof caves in. Looking back, I can see the signs as clear as floodlights, glaring and undeniable. But at the time they felt like nothing more than the natural wear and tear of a long marriage. A cold shoulder here, a missed dinner there, the kind of distance you chalk up to stress or routine, never daring to call it what it is, detachment. Lisa, my wife of 17 years, had begun to pull away in small but unmistakable ways. Our conversations, once filled with warmth and inside jokes, became more transactional, more clipped, like we were coworkers in a house we used to call a home. She'd come to bed later, wake up earlier, always wrapped in some excuse. Work deadlines, errands, migraines, anything that made physical closeness feel like an imposition. At first, I blamed myself, figured maybe I'd grown boring or predictable, a victim of my own comfort. So I did what any husband who still believes in his vows would do. I tried harder. I booked a weekend getaway, brought her flowers just because, offered to help around the house more. Even when I came home dog-tired from a job I once loved, but now endured just to keep the wheels turning. But what hit me hardest wasn't the rejection, it was the indifference. You see, rejection hurts, but at least it means you still matter enough to be pushed away. Indifference? That's where the real pain lives. And through it all, Mark, my so-called best friend, kept showing up like clockwork, always available, always around, always smiling like nothing was wrong. He'd pat me on the back and say, "You two are solid, man. Just a rough patch," with the kind of practiced sincerity that only a seasoned liar can perfect. It wasn't just Lisa who changed. Mark started to change too, in ways that didn't make sense until much later, when all the puzzle pieces finally snapped into place with horrifying clarity. He used to treat our home like sacred ground, never overstaying his welcome, always respecting the boundaries of our space. But somewhere along the line, that started to shift. He'd linger longer, drink more, and joke less about sports and more about marriage, his tone always dipping just low enough to make me uncomfortable, but never blatant enough to call him out. Lisa laughed at his jokes more than she ever did at mine, and that laugh, the one I used to think belonged to me, started to sound unfamiliar, like a stranger had borrowed her voice. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the mind plays tricks when the heart feels neglected. But deep down, buried beneath years of trust and brotherhood, a seed of suspicion had been planted, and what I didn't know then was that it had already begun to grow. It started with a glance. That was the first crack in my illusion, the moment everything I had refused to believe began inching toward the truth. I walked into the kitchen one Saturday morning, still groggy from sleep, expecting to find Lisa making coffee like she always did. Instead, I saw her leaning against the counter, phone in hand, smiling, not the polite, tired kind of smile you give a neighbor, but the kind that makes your eyes sparkle like you're 16 again and someone just said something that made your stomach flip. What froze me wasn't just the smile, but how fast it vanished when she realized I was standing there. She jumped, tucked the phone away like it was contraband, and offered a mumbled good morning without meeting my eyes. I stood there, holding the doorknob, staring at her as she busied herself with the Keurig like nothing had happened, but inside, something had shifted. I didn't know what I was seeing yet, but I knew it wasn't nothing. What came next were the coincidences, at least, that's what I called them back then because it was easier to say, that's weird, than it was to say, that's betrayal. Mark stopped by more often, and not like he used to. He didn't call ahead, didn't ask if it was a good time. He'd just show up, sometimes when I wasn't even home, like our front door was an open invitation. One evening, I came back from a late client dinner and saw his truck parked 2 blocks down from my house, tucked into a side street like he didn't want anyone to know he was there. When I walked in, Lisa looked startled, like she didn't expect me back so soon, her hair damp from a shower she swore she just took after yoga. Mark, apparently, had left a few minutes before. I laughed it off to her face, but my stomach was doing somersaults, and I swear the walls in that house started whispering secrets every time I stood still long enough to hear them. Then came the gift, an expensive leather-bound journal Lisa had mentioned in passing months ago, the kind of thing she never would have bought for herself. It showed up on her birthday, wrapped in navy blue paper with a silver bow, and she acted surprised, but not in the way you'd expect. It was the kind of surprise that felt rehearsed, like someone playing a role they weren't committed to. She told me it was from both of us, even though I hadn't bought anything yet. When I asked Mark about it, just to see what he'd say, he smiled wide and said, I figured I'd cover us this year. I know how busy you've been. That's when I realized something. Mark was speaking for both of us more than I was, and Lisa was letting him. There's a line between friendship and something more, a thin, delicate thread you don't cross. And the 2 people I trusted most in this world had already stepped over it. I just hadn't caught them yet. There are nights that fade into memory like smoke, slipping through your fingers before you've even had a chance to hold them, and then there are nights that etch themselves into your bones so deeply. You can still feel them pulsing under your skin no matter how many years have passed. For me, it was the night of Mark's backyard barbecue, a casual get-together that, on the surface, looked exactly like the dozens we'd shared over the years, the string lights casting a golden haze over laughing faces. The smell of mesquite drifting from the grill, kids chasing each other across the lawn while the adults passed around cold beer and easy smiles. But beneath all that, there was something off. Something I couldn't name yet, just a heaviness in my chest that settled in and refused to leave, like my body sensed a truth my mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. And then, like fate tipping its hand, I saw it. I had gone inside to use the bathroom, which, in Mark's house, meant walking down the hallway past his home office. The door was cracked open, and as I passed, I caught movement inside, not a conversation, not laughter, but something else, something more intimate. I froze, instinctively backing up to look again, and that's when I saw them. Lisa, Mark, standing way too close, the kind of close that makes your heart slam against your ribs because you already know what you're seeing before your brain even catches up. She had her hand on his chest, fingers spread like she'd done it 100 times before. He was smiling, not the kind of smile you give a friend's wife, but the kind that says, this isn't new. They weren't kissing. There was no smoking gun. But in that second, that single, devastating second, everything inside me cracked wide open. I didn't barge in. I didn't yell. I just turned around, walked out of the house, and stared at my reflection in Mark's truck window, trying to figure out when I became the punchline in my own life. That night, while Lisa slept beside me, peaceful, like a woman with nothing to hide, I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, my body still, but my mind moving at the speed of fire. I realized that trusting your gut isn't just some cliche thrown around by self-help gurus or motivational posters in HR offices. It's your soul trying to scream the truth through your ribcage. So I got up. Quietly. No drama. No confrontation. I went downstairs, fired up my old laptop, and started researching everything I could on spyware, trackers, hidden cameras, and data extraction. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof, the kind of evidence no one could talk their way out of, no matter how sweet the lies or well-rehearsed the denial. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. This wasn't going to be a reaction. This was going to be a reckoning. It's one thing to suspect someone is betraying you, that eats away at your mind like a slow drip of acid on steel, corroding your trust molecule by molecule. But it's another thing entirely to see it, to hold the evidence in your hands, raw and unfiltered. Like picking up a shard of broken glass that used to be your life and watching it cut you just for remembering what it once was. I didn't sleep after that barbecue night, not really. I just waited for morning, for Lisa to leave for work, for the silence to fall over the house so I could do what needed to be done. I'd already watched enough late-night YouTube tutorials and Reddit deep dives to know exactly what I was doing. With my hands still trembling, I pulled her phone from her purse, unlocked it with the same code she hadn't changed in years, our anniversary, how poetic, and connected it to my laptop. Within minutes, I had mirrored her entire phone to mine. Texts, emails, location history, even deleted photos. And that's when the world I thought I lived in crumbled like a sandcastle beneath a rising tide. There's no preparation for the first time you read the kind of messages you can't unread. The ones where your wife tells your best friend she wishes you'd leave the house more often. The ones where he calls her his girl. The ones where they share inside jokes about you. About the way you chew, the way you talk, the way you trust. And then, the photos, nothing explicit, at least not yet, but just enough to make my stomach turn. A hand on her thigh in a car that wasn't ours. A hotel room mirror selfie with her in his hoodie. There were voice notes too, lazy, mid-morning messages with her half-whispering how last night was even better than usual and promising to wear that red one next time. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, hands gripping the sides of the laptop, heart pounding so loud I thought it might crack my ribs, like my body was physically trying to reject the truth I was forcing it to swallow. This wasn't some affair I could write off as a drunken mistake or some midlife spiral. This was planned. This was routine. This was war. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't say a word. Instead, I backed everything up, stored it on 3 separate drives, locked one in my truck, hid one in my safe, and mailed the third to my brother in Colorado because I knew what was coming next wasn't going to be clean. I knew that if I blew up now, all I'd do is make noise and get excuses. No, I didn't want apologies. I didn't want tears. I wanted them to feel it. Every ounce of humiliation, betrayal, and rage that had been rotting inside my chest while they played house behind my back. So I smiled through dinner that night like a man who still believed he had a wife. I laughed at her stories like a fool with no idea. But behind my eyes, a fire had been lit, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to burn without making a sound. They say when a man truly snaps, it doesn't look like shouting or throwing punches. No, not the kind of man who spent years swallowing disappointment and dressing it up as patience. When I snapped, it looked like calm. It looked like Sunday morning coffee, like folding the laundry without being asked, like brushing my teeth next to a woman who had no idea I'd seen the way her lips curled around the word baby, and it wasn't for me. But deep down, behind the controlled breathing and steady hands, something in me had died, not quickly, but piece by piece. Like every message I read between her and Mark had peeled away another layer of love until there was nothing left but strategy. And on the 7th day, exactly 1 week after I cloned her phone and built a fortress of evidence, I walked into the kitchen while she scrolled through her messages and asked her the question that would light the fuse on everything we'd built. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I just asked, how long has it been going on between you and Mark? There was a pause, not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from calculation, the kind where a liar measures which version of the truth will hurt the least. Her thumb froze on the screen. Her jaw tensed, and for a second, I swear the air between us turned to glass. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice tight, like she hadn't already rehearsed this moment in her mind a dozen times. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just slid my phone across the counter, opened to the folder labeled Us, packed with every filthy text, every selfie, every hotel receipt, and that voice message where she told him she missed his hands. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loud. so loud I could hear my pulse in my ears and the refrigerator humming like it was trying to break the tension. Her face went pale, lips parted just slightly, eyes flicking over the screen before finally closing like she couldn't bear to look at what she'd already lived through. She didn't cry. She didn't deny it. She just said the three most pathetic words a person can offer when they've set fire to your soul. It just happened. Later that afternoon, I drove across town to Mark's auto shop, not to talk, not to argue, but to look him in the eye and see if there was a shred of guilt behind that smug little grin he wore like a badge. He walked out of the garage wiping grease off his hands, like nothing in the world had changed. When he saw me, he froze, not in fear, but in that awkward half-step people take when they know the game's over and their bluff just got called. "Hey, man," he said, like we were still friends, like I hadn't heard him call my wife his in a text thread timestamp during my mother's funeral. I didn't say a word. I just stared at him long enough for the silence to bite, then turned and walked back to my truck. That wasn't the day I lost everything. That was the day I took it all back. Because from that point forward, I wasn't going to be the husband. I wasn't going to be the friend. I was going to be the storm they never saw coming, and their silence, the only real apology I ever needed, was the first step toward my revenge. Some men rage. Some men collapse. But me? I got methodical, because when someone sets fire to your house and smiles while watching it burn, you don't waste time screaming at the smoke. You start quietly rebuilding behind their backs with steel instead of timber. After confronting Lisa and staring down Mark, I realized that pain wasn't enough, not for them, not for me. They deserved to feel it, not just for what they did, but for how easily they dismissed it, like the life I'd built for us was just some backdrop for their little affair. That week, I went into full control mode. I met with a lawyer under the guise of revising our will, but in truth, I was setting the legal groundwork for a scorched earth divorce. I quietly separated our finances, pulled all joint passwords, rerouted our shared investments into protected accounts under my name only, and she never noticed a thing. You'd be amazed how easy it is to hide in plain sight when the person you're hiding from thinks they've already beaten you. Lisa still cooked dinner. She still asked about my day with that same glassy look that used to mean love but now just reeked of guilt. I played the part of hell. I perfected the part. I'd kiss her goodnight with lips that remembered the voice memo she sent Mark about how she hated when I touched her. I'd watch Netflix with her while her phone buzzed face down on the armrest, knowing full well who it was. Meanwhile, I started collecting more. I installed a silent camera in our home office, not because I thought she'd bring him there, but because I wanted insurance, real-time proof in case she decided to flip the script in court. I copied photos off her cloud, started documenting dates, expenses, times, anything that could tie her infidelity to a timeline that proved premeditated behavior, something that courts tend to frown upon, especially when alimony is on the table. Revenge wasn't a moment. It was a process, and I was patient enough to wait for the perfect detonation. The best part? I never raised my voice. Not once. And that confused the hell out of her. You can see it in her eyes, that nervous flicker every time I smiled a little too easily, or laughed at something a bit too hard, like she knew something was off but couldn't quite put her finger on it. That's when I knew I was winning, not just the battle, but the entire war. Mark, on the other hand, had no clue. He was out there posting his gym selfies, living his double life, probably thinking he'd stolen something precious from me. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I was holding the fuse, and the match, and the whole damn powder keg. And when I finally lit it, I'd make sure everyone was watching. They say revenge is best served cold, but they never tell you how satisfying it is when you serve it with an audience. When the people who always thought you were the calm, predictable, play-it-safe kind of man finally see the fire you've been hiding under your skin. The plan came together perfectly, down to the last detail, because people like Lisa and Mark don't expect precision from the man they think they've already outsmarted. I waited until the neighborhood charity gala, an event Lisa had co-chaired for years, where half the town, including Mark's wife and most of our mutual friends, would be gathered under twinkling lights and catered hors d'oeuvres, pretending they weren't secretly judging each other. It was the ideal theater. I donated a large enough sum to get 10 uninterrupted minutes with the microphone after dinner. 10 minutes was all I needed to turn their carefully constructed fantasy into public ash. I stood up in front of the crowd in my tailored navy suit, smiling like a man who had forgiven everything and forgotten nothing. Lisa sat at our table, glowing with champagne confidence, laughing with people she thought still respected her. Mark was 2 tables over, sipping a drink he didn't pay for, whispering something into his wife's ear, the same mouth that whispered filth to mine behind my back. I tapped the mic, cleared my throat, and said I wanted to share something personal, something I'd been working on for a long time. The screen behind me lit up. I watched as her expression shifted, slowly at first, then violently, like a woman trying to wake herself from a nightmare unfolding in real time. The slideshow began with photos, ones only 2 people in that room were supposed to have seen. Then came the texts, the dates, the location pings, the screenshots. Laughter stopped. Forks froze. And then, as the final blow, I played the voice message. Her voice. Breathy. Intimate. Unmistakably hers. Talking about how our weekend had felt better than anything she'd ever done with him. The silence in that room was the kind you can taste, thick, metallic, and permanent. Mark's wife stood up first. No words, just a slow, deliberate exit. Mark looked like a man who just realized his parachute had never been packed. Lisa. Lisa tried to speak. Her lips moved, but the sound didn't follow. I walked off the stage before she could even stand, never once looking back. I didn't need to. The trap had been set, the match had been lit, and everything they'd built behind my back, all the lies, the secrecy, the smug little smiles, went up in flames in front of everyone who mattered. And for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't the fool in the room. I was the one holding the truth. What they don't tell you about revenge is that it doesn't end with the explosion. It echoes, it lingers, it seeps into the cracks of your former life like smoke after a fire, and while the people who caused the blaze choke on their own ash, you finally get to breathe again. After the gala, after the truth was aired in front of a crowd that couldn't unsee it, the fallout came fast, loud, and merciless. Lisa tried to call me the next morning, 12 times before noon, and each one went unanswered. When she showed up at the house, mascara streaked down her cheeks and her voice cracking like a broken violin, I didn't slam the door or scream or say anything cruel. I just handed her the manila envelope I'd prepared months in advance, divorce papers, asset breakdown, a non-negotiable settlement, and a court date already scheduled. Her eyes scanned the documents like she was reading the end of a book she thought she'd written, only to realize the final chapter wasn't hers anymore. She cried. I didn't. I'd already done all my grieving in silence. Mark, on the other hand, was unraveling faster than I expected, which, honestly, made it even sweeter. His wife filed for divorce within 72 hours. His name got pulled from 2 local sponsorships. One of the auto shops he contracted with dropped him cold, citing character reputation concerns. And suddenly, the guy who always strutted through life like he was untouchable found himself ghosted by the very people who used to praise his backhanded charm. I didn't even have to lift a finger after the reveal. People did the damage for me. You see, in small towns, reputations don't crumble quietly. They implode with whispers that spread faster than truth, and the man who once stole my trust got to wake up to the reality of being alone, professionally, socially, and soon, legally. I heard through the grapevine he'd started drinking more, missing deadlines, showing up late. Apparently, betrayal makes a poor business partner. And Lisa? She moved out within the week. Not to his place, though, which I found darkly poetic. She didn't get the house, didn't get a dime beyond what my lawyer agreed to in court, and when the judge reviewed the timeline I'd built, dates, messages, infidelity mapped like a war strategy, even he looked disgusted. She didn't fight the terms. I think by then, even she realized the damage was beyond repair. Her friends stopped calling. Some of them, the ones who clapped at our wedding, crossed the street now to avoid her. Every time she tried to speak, tried to justify or explain, it just made things worse. Because once the mask is off and the lies exposed, every excuse feels like an insult. She told someone I was cruel. I smiled when I heard that, because she still didn't get it. I wasn't cruel. I was done. There's a strange silence that follows closure. Not the kind filled with awkward tension or suppressed rage, but the kind that feels like stepping outside after a long, violent storm and realizing the sky has cleared and everything you thought you couldn't survive, you did. After the dust settled, after the court finalized the papers and the house was legally mine and the woman I once called my wife was nothing more than a signature on a page, I took a breath I hadn't taken in years, deep, real, and mine. I didn't celebrate. I didn't drink. I didn't party. I just packed a small bag, got in my truck, and drove to the mountains where no one knew my name. For 3 days I sat by a lake, phone off, journal open, and tried to remember who I was before the betrayal, before I became a detective in my own life, before I measured my worth and loyalty and watched it get tossed aside like a broken promise. Coming home wasn't about reclaiming anything. It was about rebuilding something new, not from the ashes of what I lost, but from the stone of what I'd learned. I sold a few investments, downsized the house, and bought a smaller place near the edge of town, quieter, simpler, but mine. I started hiking again, took up photography, and began writing about everything that happened. Not because I wanted pity, but because I needed to leave a trail behind for the next man who finds himself staring at a wife who no longer looks at him the same. Every now and then, I still hear from people who saw it all unfold. Some reach out with stories of their own, others just to say thank you. But the one message that hit me hardest came from Lisa. A plain email, no subject line, sent 3 months after the final court date. She said she missed me, said she didn't realize what she had until it was gone, said she hoped I was okay. I read it twice, then hit delete. No reply, no closure needed. Because the truth is, I am okay, better than okay. I'm free. I don't check phones anymore. I don't walk on eggshells in my own home. I sleep through the night. And when I wake up, I'm not wondering who my wife is texting or if my best friend is lying to my face. I'm not bitter. I'm not angry. I'm just done. Mark? Last I heard, he moved 2 towns over and works at a used tire shop, alone. Lisa? She's renting a condo on the other side of town, barely affording the bills she once bragged about never having to pay. Me? I sit on my porch in the morning with coffee, sunlight on my face, and peace in my chest, and every now and then, I smile, not because I won, but because I walked away while they were still playing their game. And that's what real revenge feels like.